Welcome to Imagine Otherwise, the podcast about the people and projects bridging art, activism, and academia to build better worlds. Episodes offer in-depth interviews with creators who use culture for social justice and explore the nitty-gritty work of imagining otherwise. I'm your host, Cathy Hannabach. Welcome to episode 2 of the Imagine Otherwise podcast. Today our guest is Sarah Sawyers-Lovett, who's a writer, bookseller, and co-host of 2 podcasts, including Queering the Shelves. She lives in Philadelphia with her wife and their hedgehog. Sometimes she writes zines and blogs, and occasionally people pay her to make balloon animals. In her spare time, she enjoys pickles, punks, and coffee. Sarah's the author of the excellent memoir, Everyone Else's Girl, a tale of abuse and red-hot pain, of growing up and hard beatdowns growing up queer in the U.S. South. Sarah's also the author of a brand new book called Retrospect, a Toswell's favorite eccentric zine-thology, published by Men My Dress Press, and she's going to be talking about that book with us today. Retrospect brings together selections from Sarah's long-running zine to explore growing up poor, queer, and lonely in a conservative small town in Virginia, building and losing communities and friendships, loss, abusive relationships, balloon artistry, and finding hope and love. Today, Sarah will be talking with us about that new book, her podcast, and what it means to imagine otherwise. So welcome, Sarah. Thanks for being with us.
Oh, thanks for that introduction. I'm going to have to ask you to write the copy on my next book.
Anytime. Yeah. I'm really excited to be able to talk with you. I've known you for several years now. We've worked together on a couple different projects. So I really like your writing in particular. I know you do a lot of other kind of projects that I hope we can talk about too as well. But you're just such a fantastic kind of evocative writer. So I'd love to start off talking about this fabulous new book that you have. So it's called Retrospect. It's an anthology. Tell me a little bit about this.
Okay, so I started writing zines when I was pretty young. I was like 15 or 16. And so I've always done zines. And then a couple of years ago, I had written this memoir, and I was shopping it around to publishers. And one of the publishers that I approached was Men My Dress Press, who, all they do is zine anthologies, and they do such a good job of it. Their work is just amazing. And so I had said, listen, I know this isn't typically what you guys do, but I would hate to miss out on the opportunity to work with somebody I respect and admire because I didn't ask. And they were like, well, no, this isn't really, we don't publish memoirs, but we know that your zine has been around for a while, so if you are interested in anthologizing it, we can talk about that. And I had been feeling like I had grown out of the title for a while. Toswell is the name of my hometown, and I haven't lived there since 2010, and I've lived there off and on through my life. And I felt like Philadelphia was rapidly becoming home, and maybe I needed to start thinking about the ways in which the idea of home changes. And so this was a really good organic way to put that title to rest and to sort of have a place to house all of these things that I had written over the past however many years. So that's how that came about.
That sounds awesome.
Thanks. I'm pretty stoked about it.
That was a pretty great relationship with the publisher, right? You're kind of pitching one book and they're like, oh, we love it, but we don't really do this. But we totally want your next one.
Right. Yeah, it was a really big surprise, and I'm still just sort of gobsmacked and flattered and astounded that I get to work with these 2 badass ladies that I have sort of known from around zinedom for a long time, and am constantly just in awe of. So yeah.
Yeah, awesome. Why zines? I know, what is it about that medium that does something for you?
So I think zines are the first place that I, in particular, found my voice. I found them when I was a teenager, and I was like, oh, this is a thing that I could do. And then, so you start doing it. And the great thing about zines is that as soon as you like put your first copy in like the photocopier and send it to somebody, you're part of this really connected community who overall is so supportive. And like, zines are where I learned about like feminism and Riot Grrrl and queer theory and like social justice. And so like, I think, at this point I've been involved for zines for longer in my life than I haven't. And so I think that's always going to be a part of my life.
Yeah. Do you think, since this is being published as a book, right, as a kind of the traditional format of a book, do you think that's going to change the audience, or maybe kind of how an audience experiences a zine versus how an audience would experience a book, even if it is an anthology of what was originally a zine?
Huh. I haven't really thought about that, but it's a really good question. I hope not. It is like an anthology, and it's a ton of zines. And the great thing about zines is that you can like pick them up and put them down, and like they're short, so you get this really like dense look into somebody's life without like committing to like a whole book. And I think that my favorite thing about like the zine community is that it's pretty like I can't say that word.
Hierarchical?
Yes, thank you. So I think that there is this sort of dispute of like books being more legitimate, and I don't feel like that's true. I feel like, like this is a book, it's fine. I'm very proud of it. But I also really like connecting people with zine fests and like, getting zines in the mail and like writing letters and doing all of these other things that are like very connected to like zines and punk rock and like Riot Grrrl and my childhood, rather than like, my bookseller life where I go to like bookseller conferences and talk to like fiction writers and things like that. And so I feel like it's a pretty big dichotomy. And to me, the difference is like work versus, the work that you do because you are driven to do it, Mm-hmm. Does that make sense?
Yeah, definitely. That kind of artistic and activist kind of impetus behind why you might make a zine, but also kind of why you might get involved in the kind of collaborations that can collectively produce those or circulate them, or the kind of communities you can build around those. That makes a lot of sense.
Good.
I'd like to talk a little bit more about collaboration, because I know that you work with a lot of people on various projects. You kind of alluded to a little bit with kind of zine fests and circulating zines and being part of zine communities. But how have you kind of found that experience of collaboration or kind of collective action, collective mobilization, whatever that means for you? What are some of your kind of favorite people or communities to collaborate with, and why?
Oh my gosh.
It's a big question, I know.
It is, yeah. Well, I want to preface this by saying that like I have the opportunity to work with so many people that I respect and admire, and I am a couple of cups shy of my normal level of caffeine. So if I leave anybody out, it is not personal. But I really, I have loved working with Neely and Colleen from In My Dress. It's been they've been super supportive, like throughout all my like hand dreaming and like anxiety about this book. I've really liked working with the people at Pioneers Press. They're like super supportive of my work, and I really enjoyed that. The people at my bookstore are really wonderful. Both like the customers and like my coworkers. I am actually working on a collaborative project with my friend Marija, and we spend every weekend working together. And then like through the week when we're not actually working together, we just email each other about this project that we're working on. So that's really good. I work with Grace on my primary podcast, which is called Book Jawn. And then I feel like saying that I work with my wife on a podcast is kind of a misrepresentation, because it's not really work. We are just hanging out, talking about books, and like sometimes she lets me assign books to her to read, which is really nice because she's a teacher and she usually does the assigning herself. So, but like through that, like event planning, zine planning, like I've worked with a lot of people that I really, really like, and I feel so lucky to be able to like hang out with my friends and then like put together these like events and projects that sort of mobilize the things that we have in common into like something that creates conversation.
Awesome.
So, yeah.
Since you brought it up, I think this is a nice dovetail into talking about your new podcast, or I guess both of your podcasts if you want to, but I know that you just launched a new one with Ryan called Queering the Shelves that I'd love to hear more about.
Okay, so I'm going to talk about Book Jawn first, because that's
fine.
So my friend Grace and I have worked together at like the Wood and Shoe, and then later at Big Blue Marble Books, and we have a lot in common, but we also have like pretty different taste in like books. So like we both love the same like sort of nerdy like young adult books, and then we have pretty divergent taste in like adult lit. So we were talking one day about like podcasts and podcasts that we liked, and I was like, oh, I'd love to do a podcast, but I don't really want to do any of the technical stuff. And she was like, oh, I could do all that. So I thought, all right, I'll give this a shot. And it has turned into this thing that we do like every week. We like meet up, we talk about books, we and I do some of the technical stuff now, which is pretty nice. So like we had put together this podcast that I really like, and it's an opportunity to talk about like books and publishing and like book selling and feminism and social justice. But I really wanted to talk about like exclusively queer stuff. So I started like a queer book group, and that was a really good opportunity to talk about like one book a month. And you know, my favorite person to talk about books with is my actual favorite person in the world. And so I had suggested it to Ryan that we do like a queer book podcast, thinking that she would be like, no, that's your thing. I don't want to do it. But she was pretty game for it. And she was like, I'm not going to do anything except for read books. You are going to have to do like all of the other stuff. So, you know, once a week we put a bunch of genres into a website called Thing Randomizer, and we pick a genre, and then each of us read like a book or two within that genre by like queer, trans, genderqueer, gender nonconforming authors, people within like the quilt bag spectrum, and then we talk about it for half an hour. Wow, I can't.
That sounds awesome.
Yeah, it's a lot of fun.
Do you find that it gives you a chance to kind of read a lot of stuff that, or it gives you an excuse to read a lot of stuff that maybe you don't have you wouldn't necessarily have time for, or would take you longer to get to? Yeah, I do actually. I mean, like I'm a bookseller, so I wind up with a lot of books, but if I don't like prioritize things, then they just wind up like collecting dust on a shelf. So like the way that I read books in my professional life is that I arrange them by pub date. And when I'm picking the books that I will read for review, if there is a book by like a queer person, a person of color, a gender nonconforming person, somebody who is traditionally marginalized, I will prioritize that book over like a person who is like white, cis, or straight, or a dude. And so I do wind up reading a fair amount of diverse books, but you know, I can't read everything. And so this is a really good opportunity for me to go back and read like backlist titles that I maybe haven't gotten around to. So yeah. Awesome.
Yeah.
Well, as a fellow podcaster here, and as a much newer one than you are, any advice for folks interested in creating a podcast, or just kind of wanting to learn more about why you'd make a podcast?
Well, they're fun.
They are really fun. Yeah.
I really like listening to podcasts, and they're kind of like audio zines because anybody can make them. Like the technology is pretty accessible. Like I bought a $4 microphone from the internet, and I use that to record like a couple of podcasts a week. And like, even if you can't swing like the $4, you can use like your phone or your computer, and like the information is there to learn about. You just have to have something to say and like the desire to say it, which is sort of exactly like the way that zines are a medium for like marginalized people.
That is a great connection.
Thanks.
Yeah. And then, I mean, I often hear them talked about as kind of a combination of radio and blogs, right? So you have the ones that are super heavily produced, that are often made by kind of really awesome companies with a background in radio. But then you also have the ones that are more like personal blogs, almost like people just use, as you said, using their phone or using whatever kind of technology they can get their hands on. That can also be really interesting, right? Because it lets people tell stories that wouldn't necessarily be able to get on the radio or wouldn't necessarily be able to be part of kind of mass media.
Right.
Awesome. So one of the reasons why I wanted to kind of bring you on the Imagine Otherwise podcast, aside from you have this kick-ass new book that people should know about and buy because it's amazing, but also because your work kind of as a zine author, as an artist, as a queer activist, as a memoirist, podcast host, bookseller, all of these kinds of things that you do is a really fabulous example of the type of work that this Imagine Otherwise podcast highlights. And so I was curious if you could say a little bit more about how you see your work in all of those realms, some of those realms, whichever you prefer, how you see your work combining art, activism, and or academia in the service of social justice.
So yeah, I have been thinking about this question a lot in the past couple of days. And I feel like, I am a feminist. I'm an activist. That is part of my identity. And so that, to a certain degree, informs like everything that I do. It informs like the way that I talk about books to people who come into my bookstore. It informs the way that I write. It informs the things that we talk about on these podcasts. I also feel like as somebody who identifies as like an activist and a feminist, part of like the hard work of that, like I will say, okay, so the easy part is having these places that I can put my like thoughts and opinions to work. So like, people will come in and ask me to suggest a book to them, and I'm happy to do that. I'm happy to have this podcast to talk about like queer theory and books. But having these venues also means that like in my everyday life, when somebody says something shitty in like the supermarket, or I hear some kid call another kid a fag, that I have to sort of square up to the hard conversations and say, you know what, I am an activist. And so like, if I pass by this moment and don't say anything, I have missed an opportunity to stand up for somebody who maybe couldn't. And so, I do have this privilege, and I want to use it responsibly. So what can I do for people who may not have the opportunity to? In what ways can I amplify voices that are often silenced? And like, to a certain degree, it's a case of like finding when to speak up and finding when to shut up and listen. Does that make sense? That's
a hard thing that's a fine line, right? But it's an important one.
Yeah, I agree.
Definitely. So one of my favorite questions to ask people, and I started asking this when I used to teach, and so I used to ask my students this. And when I discovered this question, it completely changed my teaching, and it changed kind of how I approached a lot of this kind of collaborative, activist, academic artwork. But I want to know what you want. So this podcast is called Imagine Otherwise. And one of the things I talk a lot about with guests is their version of a better world, or the kind of world that they're working towards when they create their amazing art, or they publish their books, or they teach their classes, or they do whatever it is that they do in the world. So what's the world you're working towards? What do you want?
I think that's hard. What I want is to be a good writer, and a writer who works hard to be responsible with my voice. I want to create a community of people who prioritize feminism and Black and trans and people of color and people with disabilities. I want to. Can I start over?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, that's such a hard question.
I know, it's a giant question, and it is designed to be kind of it pushes you to identify that, right, and to kind of figure that out for yourself. So the background behind that is that, or maybe this will help, maybe it'll just make it more confusing, I don't know. But Dorothy Allison wrote a foreword to Amber Hollabau's book, My Dangerous Desires, A Queer Girl Dreaming Her Way Home, which is a collection of essays that Hollabau had written over the course of several years about kind of about race, about place, about regionality, about queerness, about gender, feminism, sex work, all this kind of awesome stuff. And Dorothy Allison, in the foreword, she and Amber had known each other for a very, very long time and had done all this really amazing work together over the decades. And she was telling a story about how when they first became friends, which was very close to when they first became kind of kind of collaborative colleagues, compatriots, what have you, in kind of activist worlds. And she was saying, Dorothy Allison writes that it was really scary for the two of them, two lesbian femme women who had grown up very, very poor, who had grown up in kind of intensely racist spaces they grew up in different regions, but grown up in intensely racist spaces, and kind of wanted to grow into something other than that, right? And kind of had to build a world that was something other than that and something that could fight that. And they said that when they first got together as friends, it was really, they were both really nervous to tell each other what they wanted, what world they wanted instead. And that was the scariest question that they could possibly face. It wasn't how do you do this really challenging thing, or how do you overhaul structural racism, or how do you, survive kind of intense abuse, which both of them write about extensively. But the scariest question that they could imagine was what do you want? Because when you're growing up in a kind of context in which you're told you're never allowed to want anything, that's the scariest thing you could ever possibly be presented with, is the possibility that you're allowed to want something, right? And so Dorothy Allison is, as you know, is just this amazing writer that everything that she writes, it just makes you cry.
I had a full sobbing breakdown at her thing at the writer's house.
Oh yeah. She's just, she blows me away. But she said that Amber and I realized, she's speaking this, Amber and I realized that revolutions happen when you look at each other and say, I want, and mean it. And we meant it. And that quote just kills me. But that's the impetus behind this question. It's a scary question, I realize, because it means being vulnerable. Because when we want something, we're vulnerable. When we have desires, we're vulnerable, right? Because someone can take that away. Someone can challenge that. Someone knows something about us. So I don't mean for it to be an invasive question, but it is kind of an intense political and ethical question of what do you actually want? What world do you want? What are you working towards? Because that's, of course, the first step in the revolution, right? Is figuring that out.
Okay, I think I'm ready.
Okay.
I think that helped. Thank you. That is an amazing quote.
I know, right?
All right. So I want to do work that fulfills me, that other people appreciate, and that adds value to their lives. I want a family, which is not something that I've always been comfortable saying that I wanted, even if that family is just like chosen family or glitter family, as I like to call it, I want a community of feminists, of people that I like and admire and respect, and I want to be valued by that community, and I want for us to celebrate each other. I want to do work that changes the world, and I want to be part of my friends doing work that changes the world. I want to read books and hang art and listen to music that my friends have made that is valuable and important to them. And I want to wake up every morning until I'm like 1,000 to my favorite person in the world, and to fall asleep beside of her, and to let that not be a controversial thing. I want to watch the queer community celebrate and protect the people who are most vulnerable, instead of prioritizing white masculine guys. And I want it to be about celebrating our differences rather than being an attractive marketing demographic.
That's a pretty fantastic vision.
Thanks.
I want that too.
I want a lot more than that. And I'm sure that will change. I'm never not going to want more. But I think what I want will obviously always change depending on when you ask the question. But I want to be actively moving towards that world with people who share that vision.
That's awesome.
Thanks.
Yeah. Well, it sounds like you're off to a pretty good start with that. Okay. Well, didn't mean to get heavy at the end there, but this is a really kind of good, I think it's a good way to open out onto so we talked about specific projects you're working on and specific publications and stuff, but this is the kind of impetus behind it all, right? This is the vision. This is the big picture. This is the why does it all matter kind of thing. So I'm glad we kind of got to open out onto some of those kind of collective as well as individual desires. So thank you.
Sure. So
where can we find you online, and where can we buy your fabulous new book, Retrospect, and where can we listen to your podcasts?
All right. So you got a pen? Just kidding.
This will also be in the show notes, by the way, but it's nice to hear you actually say it.
Oh, thanks. So I occasionally blog at punkjoanavark.com, not as often as I should. Most of the time when I do writing, it's about books, and it's on bookjawnpodcast.com or queerpodcast.com. You can get my book from my Etsy, and I'll send you the link to that. Or maybe I already have. And you can get it from the Men in My Dress Press website as well. I think actually you can probably just Google Retrospect and my name, and places that you can buy it will come up.
Cool. Yeah. And I'll put all those in the show notes as well as the places that your book is available.
Thanks.
Yeah. So thank you so much. This has been really fantastic.
Yeah, thanks for having me on the show. It was a lot of fun.
Yeah. So check out Sarah's new book, Retrospect, her zine-thology. Also, I highly recommend her memoir, Everybody Else's Girl, if you haven't already had a chance to look at that. From what I understand, Retrospect kind of picks up where that leaves off. So it's, if you want, a kind of mini binge experience over the next week or so, you can pick up both and read them in order. And also be sure to check out Sarah's both of her podcasts, Book Jawn and Queering the Shelves. Do you have anything that you want to add?
Oh, yeah. I should mention that Everybody Else's Girl is out of print now. So I have a few copies in stock, and you can get this from my Etsy, but I don't think that you can get them anywhere else.
Oh, no.
Yeah. Well, you can probably get them used online somewhere or other.
Well, clearly we should start a campaign to get that back in print.
Oh, I don't know.
Well, then at least check out Sarah's Etsy shop to get the last few precious copies of that, because it's absolutely not to be missed. Thanks for listening to another episode of Imagine Otherwise. Editing for this episode was done by Julie Leonard. Be sure to check out our website at imagineotherwise.com to listen to full episodes, read show notes, and see links to the people, books, and projects discussed on the show. You can also subscribe to us on iTunes.